So when we say architecture, it is all about the infrastructure architecture, which means the IT infrastructure architecture, which involves your servers, it involves your load balancers, it involves your database, it involves your cache, like whatever components you might be learning in your classes. It's all about that architecture, that how are you going to combine all the components together and make it a good architecture which is going to support an application. So when you use Netflix, there are hundred of servers which are getting in used, and you never know this because you just see it on one click. Being a user, being an end user, we see everything on one single click. But how the request is getting processed, how the infrastructure architecture is being created behind the scenes, that when you click on watch movie button, the movie pops up and you start watching movie without even downloading it. So there is the efficient IT infrastructure which is sitting in the background. And being a cloud architect or being a cloud engineer, your responsibility is to architect the infrastructure in such a way that it is more efficient, it is robust, and it is taking care of all the things. So when we say infrastructure, it is all about, or it is all about that how different components or how different infrastructure components connect together. So that is what the IT infrastructure or IT architecture is. Now, why do we need to know IT architecture? Okay, we know servers, we know how to create EC2 or virtual machine in the cloud. We know that. Superb. We know how to basically balance the load. Using elastic load balancer, we can balance the load. We know, okay, in databases, we are going to store data. That is also very clear to us. But why it is important to have a knowledge of architecture in the interview, and why this question has become the most important question of any interview? That is because having architecture knowledge always defines that how much knowledge you have overall. If you know the architecture, it means you know every component. So it is easier for the interviewer to rate you on each and every service if you define the architecture. That is why I was listening to one of the interview some days before, and the very first question, and it was the Amazon interview. You can imagine it was the Amazon interview. And the very first question which was asked in the interview was, how will you define the multi-tier architecture? And I was surprised. I was surprised that none of the interviewer asked about servers. None of the interview asked about the load balancer. None of the interviewer asked about databases. They just asked about the multi-tier architecture. And that was the only question asked in the interview. And there were some following questions as well on the architecture. So you can imagine that how important it is. And that is why we brought this question in this interview preparation session or a webinar, to make sure that you guys are aware. And when you go next time in the interview, you guys are prepared. Now, it defines your experience. Okay, it defines your experience. You might know all the components. Okay, you might know all the components that defines, or how these components connect together, that defines your knowledge. Now, that will be the first question they will ask you. Describe about multi-tier architecture. You will tell about some of the components. You will tell how these components connect together. That will define your knowledge, that, okay, you have the knowledge, you know how to connect different components together. But following questions will define your experience. Okay, like they will ask that if this particular component is not working, how will you make it working? That is what your experience is going to answer. So you will say, okay, I will replace it by something else, or I will do some automation like ASG, auto scaling group, and immediately I will auto scaling group is going to replace the EC2 instance. That defines your experience, that you are aware that how you are going to handle the architecture if it fails? Because anything can fail, right? Anything can fail at any moment. So you are going to define your experience by telling the answer on the architecture, and those will be the following answers to the questions asked in the interview. Okay, that is why having the AWS architecture knowledge is must. Now there are multiple architectures. Okay, first one is the multi-tier architecture. Second is, so some people call it as multi-tier architecture, or you can say three-tier architecture. Okay, so three-tier architecture. It like the interviewer can ask you what is multi-tier architecture, or the interviewer can ask you what is three-tier architecture, but it is one and the same thing. So don't worry about it. That what is three-tier architecture? Don't get surprised by hearing three-tier architecture. Multi-tier architecture and three-tier architecture both are same. So don't worry about it. And in today's session, we will discuss about multi-tier or three-tier architecture. After that, there is another architecture which is very popular in the market right now, that is the serverless architecture. And on serverless architecture, we are going to have the webinar next time on serverless architecture, where we will understand that how serverless architecture works, why serverless architecture is considered to be the best, and in what scenario you are going to use serverless architecture. So that is what we will study in future session. And third, then there can be a question which can be asked that will be on microservice based architecture, which is very popular. And few of you who have been attending our live projects, one of the project is on microservice and one of the project is on serverless. So I hope you guys have a good amount of knowledge on serverless and microservice who have already attended our live projects. So these are the two architectures which we will be discussing in next webinars. But in today's session, we will again, I'm just telling it again that we will be talking about multi-tier architecture or three-tier architecture.